This is them boys here, a.k.a. the Briscoes, Sandy Fort, Delaware, in the house, 302. And you're watching Wrestling with Regret. Say something, Jay. How we doing this morning, folks? This man here said it better than I could ever say it myself. You're watching Wrestling with Regret.
Over the last few years in this channel, I've been known to say a thing or two about Japanese wrestling, and I mean that quite literally. I don't watch enough to say more than a thing or two about it at any given time. Whether it be the hypersexualized character of Razor Ramon Hadage, the hypersexualized 17-year-old Boston Crabs and want to be the strongest in the world, or the shouldn't be sexualized at all calamari wrestler, needless to say, the material I've looked at on this channel has been a little odd by my narrow Western standards. But even I know there's more to the country than anime girls, tentacles, and an unfortunate mixing of the two. For decades, grapplers all over the world have looked at Japan as the goal, the #1 destination to hone their craft and earn their stripes, not to mention to score a sweet Ribera Steakhouse jacket. Many foreign wrestlers, or gaijin, have come and gone through the land of the rising sun, but only a few of them have gone on to legendary status, leaving indelible marks on the business as a whole on a global scale. And this week, I'm gonna rank them, the top 8 foreigners who were big in Japan. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to avoid anyone who's currently wrestling and whose careers have not been solidified yet. That means no Kenny Omega, no Prince Devitt, or no MVP, who to date is the only person to win a company's inaugural Intercontinental Championship in an actual tournament. And while it's fun to look at the careers of guys who only did well in Japan, the point of this countdown is to look at foreign wrestlers who did the best both there and at home. That means we won't be talking about guys like Johnny Ace, Michael Modest, Bison Smith, or Bob Sapp, who, boy, I really gotta find another reason to talk about this guy soon. Number 8. Bruiser Brody and Abdullah the Butcher. They are men who are synonymous with each other in professional wrestling. It's hard to talk about Abdullah the Butcher without talking about one of his fiercest rivals in Bruiser Brody, and vice versa. But ironically, even though these two brought the house down with their legendary wars in Texas and Puerto Rico, they didn't really face off all that much in Japan. Be that as it may, the two were able to carve out their own separate paths in the East. The towering Brody made a lot of money working for All Japan during the 1980s, winning the NWA International title 3 times, as well as having successful teams with Stan Hansen and Jimmy Snuka. As for Abdullah, before terrifying WCW audiences, he'd feuded with the likes of Giant Baba, Jumbo Saruta, and Terry Funk, and over the years had worked for New Japan, Dragon Gate, and even Hustle. In later years, he'd be bestowed the highest honor in Japanese pop culture, having several anime characters created in his likeness. Number 7. Dynamite Kid. As one half of the British Bulldogs in the World Wrestling Federation with cousin Davey Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid did well for himself in the tag team scene before injuries took their toll. But before that, Tom Billington blazed a trail in Japan and became a pioneer of today's cruiserweight style. Working for IPW in New Japan through a working relationship with Stu Hart's Stampede Wrestling, Dynamite made his name in the early 80s with outings against future Hall of Famer Tatsumi Fujinami and the first Tiger Mask. The feud between Billington and Tiger Mask would set the standard for their weight class for the next 3 decades and would include multiple battles for the WWF Light Heavyweight title, which at that point was basically Japan exclusive. The two would clash one last time in 1996 for Michinoku Pro, 15 years after their first battle, in what would be the final match of Dynamite Kid's career. Number 6. Freddie Blassie. The Hollywood fashion plate, Freddie Blassie was one of the biggest heels of his day, inciting near riots and drawing record gates in his home territory of Los Angeles. In his later years, he'd become an iconic manager in the World Wrestling Federation. But it was his run in Japan and feud with national icon Rikidozan that turned him into a global star. The two fought for the WWA Championship both in LA and in Japan, resulting in blood-soaked bouts. According to legend, some Japanese people watching the matches at home suffered heart attacks after seeing Blassie bite and bloody Rikidozan's forehead. Blassie's run in Japan helped further establish the country as a premier territory for wrestling. Number 5. Big Van Vader. In wrestling, there are few who embody what it meant to be a monster heel as much as Vader did. Big Van Vader made his New Japan debut in 1987, beating company founder Antonio Inoki in less than 5 minutes. That would result in a riot, which got New Japan banned from Sumo Hall for 2 years. Vader soon ascended to become the 4th IWGP Heavyweight Champion, making him the first foreigner to hold the belt, a title he would hold 3 times in all. He had epic feuds with Inoki, Tatsumi Fujinami, and Stan Hansen, in a war that nearly cost him his eye. Vader would even win the Heavyweight Tag Team Championship with fellow big man Bam Bam Bigelow in 1992. Winning major gold across 4 different companies in the country, Japan would remain open to Vader for the rest of his career, as he performed in both countries simultaneously while working for both WCW and the WWF. In his later years, he'd remain an occasional presence in Japan, including teaming with his son Jesse on a charity show that benefited victims of the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami disaster of 2011. Number 4. Terry Funk. The former world champion and the king of retirement styles had a career spanning 5 decades with many notorious moments to his credit, and a lot of that notoriety took place overseas. Shortly after debuting in 1965, he and brother Dory Jr. made their way east, establishing themselves as loud, rowdy, prototypical Americans. But what really made the Funker a legend in Japan was the price that he paid in blood. Buckets and buckets and buckets of blood. His initial run in All Japan saw some brutal wars with guys like Bruiser Brody, Abdullah the Butcher, and the original Sheik, but the event that would be coveted among tape traders for years to come would take place at IWA Japan in the King of the Deathmatch tournament in 1995. The finals would see Funk take on his protege and future legend in his own right, Cactus Jack, in a no-rope, explosive barbed wire board time bomb death match. Talk about killing the business. What's wrong with the good old-fashioned 5-minute headlock? Cited by many as the greatest death match of all time, Funk allegedly demanded even more explosives for the match after being unimpressed during pre-show demonstrations. Following this match, Funk would gain the reputation of being a hardcore legend, which he'd carry the rest of his career through ECW, WWE, WCW, and even returning to Japan multiple times as recently as 2013. And hey, how many gaijin do you know with a hit record in Japan?
Sometimes I feel so sad. People think I'm so mean. My heart is soft and sweet, but I'm still a fighting machine.
Number 3. Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen's often cited as perhaps the most successful gaijin, and it's hard to argue against. After feuding with Bruno Sammartino in the mid-70s and breaking the champ's neck in the process, Hansen took that reputation with him to New Japan. That short run would end when Hansen jumped ship to All Japan Pro Wrestling and never looked back. The man that virtually every cowboy in wrestling after him has been based off of, Hansen was a dominant force in AJPW for the next 2 decades. Aside from being the only man to pin both Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba in championship matches, he'd also feud with the likes of Genichiro Tenryu, Riki Chosu, Misawa, Terry Gordy, and more. Along with winning championship gold, he also won the World's Strongest Tag Determination League 4 separate times with 4 separate partners. Oh yes, and he also wrestled for the AWA and became their world champion during all this. In 1990, Hansen made a relatively brief pit stop in WCW before going back to All Japan, where he'd remain until his in-ring retirement in 2001. Hansen remains loyal to AJPW to this day, and was even named the chairman of All Japan's governing body after being hand-selected by the widow of Giant Baba before he gave the spot up in 2007. Number 2. The Destroyer, Dick Beyer. The epitome of old school and a man who doesn't get quite enough love these days, Dick Beyer got to start wrestling in America in the 1950s during the dawn of the television age. The Destroyer's look is classic. I mean, if you just closed your eyes and tried to imagine what your prototypical old school masked wrestler would look like, it'd probably be that guy.
Hey, Zane.
Ah! What do you want?
Nothing. Just want to say hi.
Okay, I'm kind of in the middle of a review right now. Can I get back to you?
Okay, no problem, Zane. I'll be here. Waiting.
All right, thank you. How often are you in my eyes anyway?
I watch you in your sleep.
Oh. A year after his famous hair versus mask match in 1962 against Gorgeous George, which saw the Gorgeous One lose his famous locks, the Destroyer would return to the Olympic Auditorium in LA to work a program with Giant Baba. The boss of All Japan Pro Wrestling would bring Beyer to Japan and cement him as a top baddie in a match against Ricky Dozan, in a match that was seen by a TV audience of 70 million people. Over the next 3 decades in Japan, Bayer would be instrumental in building the legacies of such wrestlers as Mil Mascaras, Antonio Inoki, Hiro Matsuda, and countless others. Not only was he the first true American superstar in the country, paving the way for the generations that would follow him, he was arguably one of the first crossover stars, taking full advantage of television's reach. Despite growing up in the heat of anti-Japanese sentiment in World War II, the Destroyer admired Japan as much as the country itself admired him. In 2017, 2 years before his death at 88, Japan bestowed Bayer with its 3rd highest honor, the Order of the Rising Sun, for a lifetime spent promoting goodwill and bicultural exchanges between Japan and the United States. Before I give you my number 1 pick, here are a few honorable mentions. Terry Gordy and Dr. Death Steve Williams. In America, few men were as tough as these big bruisers. Gordy, best known as one part of the fabulous Freebirds, and Williams, a former UWF champion for Bill Watts and Herb Abrams, the two would go on to have massive success in Japan as a tag team. Dubbed the Miracle Violence Connection, they'd become 5-time AJPW Tag Team Champions over a 9-year period, while Williams would hold the belts 2 more times as Stan Hansen, along with the Triple Crown Heavyweight title in 1994. The team would also make their presence known back in WCW, where they'd hold that company's tag titles as well after an all-out war with the Steiner brothers. They were also named the Wrestling Observer's Tag Team of the Year in 1992. Scott Norton. If you're unfamiliar with this man's work, you might only know him as the guy who almost disappeared during WCW's tour of North Korea, or as the guy who's objectively the best to play as in WCW NWO World Tour. But his work in Japan helped make him a lot of money in the States as well. Following his debut in the AWA and a stint in the Pacific Northwest territory, Norton made his way to New Japan in 1990, where he'd win the IWGP Heavyweight Tag titles with 2 different partners. He'd eventually sign with WCW, which at the time had a working agreement with New Japan. Norton would win the vacant IWGP Heavyweight title in 1998 and would even defend it back home on Nitro against such luminaries as Van Hammer and Lodi. Soon after the dissolution of WCW, Norton would regain the title, making him one of a handful of foreigners to have won the prestigious title more than once. Norton would appear in Japan on and off for the next several years, most recently taking part in the New Japan Rumble at Wrestle Kingdom 11 in 2017. Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. It goes without saying that these two were megastars in America, particularly as part of the late 80s boom period, but both men also had notable Japanese careers. Before Hulkamania ran wild, Hogan would perform in Japan in the early 1980s, wrestling a far more technical style we're used to seeing in the West. Andre the Giant, of course, was a global attraction, having appeared in Japan as far back as 1970 and working with and against such names as Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. Both men participated in and won various precursors to the modern G1 climax, with Hogan technically becoming the first ever IWGP champion, winning the inaugural International Wrestling Grand Prix and the belt that came with it. Years later, the Hulkster would also bring the WWF Championship overseas in the early 90s, facing off against legends such as the Great Muta and Tatsumi Fujinami. And my pick for the biggest foreign wrestler to also be big in Japan is Karl Gotch. We've spoken of legends on this countdown, but in the world of Puroresu, this gaijin is a god, and I mean it too. His nickname in Japan was Kami-sama, which means deity. An Olympic wrestler in both freestyle and Greco-Roman, insane fitness machine Charles Istaz of Belgium trained in England to become a catch wrestler and would find himself working in the US as Karl Gotch. While in America, he would capture a world championship and compete against other greats such as Don Leo Jonathan and Gene Kiniski. When a 1962 backstage incident would end with Gotch injuring then NWA World's Champion Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, Gotch would flee the stage for the shores of Nippon, where he would change the sport forever. Antonio Inoki admired Gotch's submission-based style and would find himself altering his own approach to the sport based on it. Gotch would main event the first ever New Japan Pro Wrestling show against Inoki, and throughout the 70s and 80s would serve as the booker and head trainer for New Japan. After retiring from competition in 1982, he would personally train such names as Hiro Matsuda, the original Tiger Mask, Yoshiaki Fujiwara, and Murder Daddy himself, Minoru Suzuki. Several of his students would go on to create the UWF International, which would become a platform for a more shoot-based style professional wrestling, and is credited as the precursor to the mixed martial arts movement in both the US and Japan. Not only that, it would also lay the groundwork for the evolution to today's strong style. On the 10th anniversary of his death in 2017, a separate funeral was held for Gotch in Japan, where he was given a black onyx tombstone personally funded by Inoki. For rising from a blackballed Walt Disney lookalike to a true wrestling god and influencing an entire wrestling philosophy, Karl Gotch is my pick as the biggest foreign wrestler to be big in Japan. Who did I miss? Let me know in the comment section below. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you like it, subscribe to Wrestling with Regret, and buy the t-shirts at ProWrestlingTees.com. I'm Brian Zane, and I'll see you next time.